Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. In this season, we're covering Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. In Episode 7, we shift focus to the sociological lens, exploring how society shapes crime and deviance.
Yeah, it's a really significant shift, actually. We've looked quite a bit at the individual level, the biological factors, the psychological ones, trying to pinpoint something within the person.
Right, asking why this person.
Exactly. But now we're sort of zooming out, looking at the bigger context, the social environment, the structures of society, the norms, the opportunities, or crucially, the lack of opportunities that society presents.
And that's the core of sociological positivism.
That's the heart of it, yes. Looking at how these external social factors influence criminal behavior.
So it's less about what's inside your head and more about what's happening around you.
Precisely. And it's worth noting this perspective, sociological positivism, generally sees crime as a real problem, something that threatens the social order and needs managing or controlling.
Okay, so it acknowledges crime is real and harmful.
It does. It differs a bit from some later theories, like the victimized actor model we might touch on later, which really questions how crime gets defined and how that definition is linked to power. Sociological positivism is more focused on finding the social causes of behaviors that are already defined as criminal.
Gotcha. And the positivism part, that still implies a scientific method, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The idea is to use scientific methods but apply them to social phenomena. Think measurement, observation, data collection.
But what are they measuring? You can't exactly put society in a test tube.
No, you can't. So they measure indicators of social conditions or social disorganization. Things like crime statistics, rates of drunkenness, suicide rates, poverty levels, housing density in specific areas.
Like social vital signs for a neighborhood.
That's a good way to put it. They try to map these indicators, identify geographic areas where these problems cluster, finding the trouble spots.
And the goal of mapping these spots.
The idea is that once you identify these high-risk areas, you can target interventions, maybe implement social programs, increase control measures, or try to address the underlying social disorganization that's believed to be causing the crime.
Makes sense. Has this kind of approach been around long?
It actually has pretty deep roots, going back to the 19th century, even before sociology was really formalized as a discipline.
Oh, really? Who was doing that?
You had figures sometimes called the moral statisticians, people like Adolphe Quetelet in Belgium and André Michel Guéry in France. They were pioneers in collecting and analyzing statistics on things like crime and suicide, looking for patterns across different regions and social groups.
So using data to understand social problems, even back then.
Exactly. And in England, you had social campaigners like Henry Mayhew, who did incredibly detailed observational studies of London's poor.
All right, London labor and the London poor.
That's the one. And Patrick Colquhoun, who focused on policing in London, they were using empirical methods, observation, trying to understand the conditions in urban centers where crime seemed to thrive. They laid a lot of the groundwork.
So this idea that crime isn't just random badness, but connected to social conditions, has a long history.
A very long history. But the persons who really built the theoretical foundation for sociology and for this sociological perspective on crime was Emile Durkheim.
Okay, Durkheim, a huge name in sociology. Where do we start with him?
Well, he's often considered the founding father of academic sociology in France. His work was incredibly rigorous, and he powerfully argued for the primacy of social factors over individual ones.
And he wasn't just arguing against biology and psychology.
No, he also took aim at the rational actor theories. Social contract ideas, utilitarianism.
Why? What was his issue with those? They seem to involve society.
They do. But Durkheim's critique was sharp. He argued that in societies marked by significant inequality, what he called a forced division of labor, you couldn't really talk about fair or just contracts between individuals and society. The starting points were too unequal.
So the idea of a rational calculation based on mutual benefit didn't hold up for him.
Not when the system itself was inherently unfair. For Durkheim, social forces weren't just a backdrop. They fundamentally shaped individual action and even individual consciousness.
You mentioned earlier he's sometimes misinterpreted, maybe seen as more conservative than he was.
Yes, that's an important clarification, and something Hopkins Burke points out, drawing on critiques by Taylor, Walton, and Young. Often, the conservative label fits better with someone like Auguste Comte. Comte saw industrialization leading to social breakdown and a loss of moral authority.
And Comte thought sociology should fix that.
Right. Comte believed crime resulted from this lack of moral guidance, and that a positive social science should step in and essentially create a new, higher moral authority for society.
But Durkheim disagreed.
He did. He rejected Comte's rather utopian view of human nature, always striving for perfection. Durkheim didn't think some external moral authority could simply contain human desires indefinitely.
So what was Durkheim's view of human nature?
He proposed a kind of dualism. There's the body, with its biological drives and instincts, but then there's the soul, which develops through social interaction, through internalizing the moral consensus of the group.
So society shapes us from the inside out, in a way.
That's the idea. Social order depends on this shared moral consensus. But Durkheim saw this consensus as dynamic, constantly evolving, especially in complex modern societies.
It sounds a bit like Freud, maybe, the idea of society shaping or repressing instincts.
There's a parallel, definitely. Both saw some form of socialization or repression as necessary for civilization, but their focus differed. Freud was more concerned with individual psychological well-being and the conflicts that arise from repression. Durkheim was focused on social order, preventing conflict between the individual and society that comes from uncontrolled desires.
And he had terms for those uncontrolled desires.
Yes. Egoism, excessive self-interest, and anomie, a state of normlessness where society fails to regulate individual aspirations. For Durkheim, human desires are potentially limitless unless society provides external controls and guidance.
Anomie. That seems like a key concept. What was Durkheim's main focus regarding social change?
His major work, The Division of Labor in Society, really tackled this. He was deeply concerned with the massive social changes happening during industrialization, and specifically with what he called the forced division of labor, where social roles weren't allocated fairly or integrated properly. And in that book, he introduced his really famous distinction between two types of social solidarity, or social glue.
Okay, what are they?
Mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is what you find in simpler, traditional societies. It's based on likeness, on similarity. People do similar work, share the same beliefs, the same values. Conformity is high.
Like a small village where everyone knows everyone and does similar things.
Exactly. The collective conscience, the shared morality and beliefs is incredibly strong and rigid. Individuality is low. The law in these societies tends to be repressive, punishing anyone who deviates, not just to control them, but to strongly reaffirm the group's values. Punishment shows the deviant is not one of us.
And this is where he says crime is normal. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but it's a crucial part of his argument. In societies with high mechanical solidarity, crime and its punishment actually serve a vital function. They reinforce the moral boundaries. By punishing the rule breaker, the group reaffirms what it stands for.
So punishing crime actually strengthens the society.
In this type of society, yes. Durkheim went further, arguing that if you somehow eliminated all the acts currently defined as criminal, the society would just start defining other previously acceptable behaviors as criminal. It needs crime, in a sense, to maintain its moral consensus.
Wow, so a society without any crime at all would be unhealthy.
From his perspective, yes. It would likely be pathologically over-controlled, stifling any innovation or individuality, which he saw as necessary for social progress. Even minor deviance can signal necessary social adjustments.
Okay, that's mechanical solidarity. What about organic solidarity?
Organic solidarity is characteristic of modern, complex, industrial societies with a high degree of division of labor. Think of specialized jobs and roles. Here, solidarity isn't based on everyone being the same, but on their interdependence.
Like the organs in a body, different functions, but all necessary for the whole.
Precisely that analogy. People are bound together because they rely on each other's specialized skills and functions. Society is held together by managing this diversity, not enforcing uniformity.
And societies aren't purely one or the other.
No, it's a spectrum. You find pockets of mechanical solidarity even within highly organic societies. Think of very tight-knit small groups or communities. But Durkheim's key point was that the shift towards organic solidarity, driven by the division of labor, wasn't necessarily a bad thing, unlike what some conservatives feared.
So he saw it as progress.
He did. He argued it didn't destroy the collective conscience, it just changed its content. The focus shifted. In mechanical solidarity, the individual is subordinate to the collective. In organic solidarity, there's a greater emphasis on the rights and dignity of the individual. Society has obligations to the individual. He called this moral individualism.
Moral individualism.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean just selfishness, though.
Not at all. It's about a system of reciprocal rights and obligations that bind individuals together in their different roles. It's a moral framework suited to complexity. This is where he really differed from people like Adam Smith or the utilitarians, who saw the division of labor mainly in economic terms: efficiency, growth. Durkheim stressed its moral role in integrating society and restraining pure self-interest.
So for Durkheim, the problems of his time, inequality, conflict weren't caused by the division of labor itself.
No, they were caused by an imperfectly regulated division of labor. The laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century, with its unregulated markets and stark inequalities, was, in his view, dangerous because it lacked the proper moral regulation needed for organic solidarity to function healthily. This failure of regulation led to social problems, including crime and deviance.
How did he categorize deviance within this framework? Did he have different types?
He did,
Yeah.
and they relate to the state of the social order. He acknowledged the biological deviant, someone whose behavior stems from individual physiological or psychological issues that connects back to the individual positivism we discussed before.
Okay.
But more relevant here are deviants linked to social conditions. There's the functional rebel. This is a basically normal person reacting against a pathological society, one with a forced or unjust division of labor. Their rebellion is actually functional because it highlights social strains and injustices. It expresses the true, underlying collective consciousness against an artificial one.
So rebellion can be a healthy sign in a sick society.
It can be interpreted that way within his framework, yes. Then there's the skewed deviant, who is someone socialized into a disorganized, pathological social environment. They've learned the wrong norms because the social environment itself is dysfunctional. These are often the deviants that sociological studies tend to focus on.
And what did Durkheim see as the main drivers of increased crime in modernizing societies?
He pointed to two main factors linked to the breakdown of regulation. First, unbridled egoism, where individual desires aren't properly checked by social norms, undermining solidarity. Second, and perhaps more famously, anomie.
Normlessness.
Right, a state where the rules are unclear, ambiguous, or just haven't caught up with rapid social change. This happens during periods of upheaval, economic booms, depressions, rapid industrialization. The old norms break down, but new ones haven't solidified yet.
And this links back to his idea of limitless desires.
Exactly. He believes society normally regulates our aspirations, tells us what's reasonable to want and expect. But during anomic periods, this regulation falters. In an economic boom, aspirations might soar unrealistically high. In a bust, people might find it intolerable to lower their expectations. This lack of clear limits, this mismatch between desires and achievable reality, fuels frustration, deviance, and crime.
This all sounds quite powerful, but also very top-down. Like individuals are just puppets of social forces. Is that where the criticism of determinism comes in?
That's precisely the main criticism. His work, especially interpreted straightforwardly, can seem like methodological collectivism. Individuals appear to have very little agency or choice. Their lives seem almost predestined by their social position and the prevailing social conditions. And this reading has led some to label him politically conservative, seeming to legitimize the status quo.
But you mentioned a counter-argument, a different reading.
Yes. More recent interpretations, like the one Boudin offers, read Durkheim through a lens of methodological individualism. In this view, individuals do make choices, they form groups, they act strategically, and they can bring about social change.
But the social structure still matters.
Critically, the choices individuals make are always constrained by structural factors, norms, resources, opportunities. And in situations where the collective conscience is extremely strong, like in pockets of intense mechanical solidarity, those constraints can be so powerful that individual choice is severely limited, sometimes virtually non-existent. It's not no choice, but constrained choice.
Constrained choice, that sounds like a key distinction. How does that interpretation get applied to something specific, like hate crime?
Hopkins, Burke, and Pollock use exactly this interpretation. They argue that even in our complex, supposedly organic societies, mechanical solidarity hasn't disappeared. It persists at different levels: macro, like national identity or strong religious beliefs; mezzo, organized hate groups; and micro, small gangs, local neighborhood groups.
So these strong conformity-based group identities are still around.
Yes, and hate group philosophies often explicitly rely on ideas of collective identity, common values, homogeneity. Anyone different is labeled an outsider, a threat. Deviance, including acts of hate, functions to police the boundaries of the group and reinforce that shared identity by censoring the other.
And these different levels of solidarity can interact.
They argue they do. For example, insecurities within a dominant group, maybe related to economic changes or immigration, might be exploited by political rhetoric, macro level, creating an environment where hate groups, meso level, or localized incidents, micro level, flourish. Perpetrators might feel alienated, construct themselves as victims, and feel justified in targeting others.
So hate crime isn't just random malice. It's potentially rooted in these persistent forms of group belonging and boundary maintenance.
That's the argument, drawing on this constrained choice view of Durkheim. It shows his enduring influence. Despite the debates, his core idea linking crime to breakdowns in social controls, his concepts of anomie and egoism, were incredibly influential for 20th century sociology, particularly the work done in the rapidly changing cities of America.
Which takes us neatly to the Chicago School.
Exactly. The context here is crucial. The early 20th century in the U.S., especially cities like Chicago, undergoing massive, rapid transformation. Industrialization, huge waves of immigration, explosive population growth.
And probably pretty tough conditions for many people.
Absolutely. Low wages, long hours, dangerous factories, overcrowded slum housing, poor sanitation, health problems. It was a harsh environment.
And the sociologists at the University of Chicago saw a direct link between this environment and crime.
They did. Their central conclusion was that growing up and living in these negative conditions had a profound impact. Crime wasn't just an individual failing, it was fundamentally a social problem, rooted in the social environment. Their view was actually quite optimistic in a way they believed if you could change the environment, you could change the people.
So what were the key ideas that came out of the Chicago School?
Robert Park was a major figure. He brought ideas from ecology into urban sociology. He saw the city not as chaotic, but as developing in patterns, much like natural ecosystems. Different groups within the city were like different species, symbiotic, interdependent, competing for space and resources.
A social ecology.
Precisely. He observed patterns of migration and change, how immigrant groups tended to settle first in the poorest areas and then move outwards as they assimilated, being replaced by newer groups. He argued these observable social processes impacted behavior, including crime, and that this could be studied systematically. That really set their research agenda.
And Ernest Burgess built on that with his model of the city.
Yes, Burgess developed the famous concentric zone model. He proposed that cities tend to grow radially outwards from the center in a series of concentric rings or zones. This spatial distribution wasn't random, but resulted from processes of competition and dominance.
Can you describe those zones briefly?
Sure. At the center, you have the Central Business District, Zone 1. Then, crucially for crime studies, came Zone 2, the zone in transition. Beyond that were zones of working-class homes, then more affluent residential areas, and finally the outer commuter zone, the suburbs.
And the zone in transition was the focus. Why?
Because it was the area immediately surrounding the expanding business district. It was characterized by physical deterioration, old tenements, often near factories. It was the least desirable place to live, constantly being invaded by business and industry. And it was the area with the highest population turnover, the first port of call for newly arrived, poor immigrant groups.
And Burgess linked this instability directly to social problems.
He did. He argued that this constant flux, poverty, and mix of different cultures weakened traditional social ties, family structures, community bonds, informal social control. This resulted in what they termed social disorganization. And that was their primary explanation for why crime rates were highest there.
Social disorganization as the cause of crime. Did they test this idea empirically?
Yes. Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay did the classic empirical work. They meticulously collected data, primarily juvenile court statistics, and mapped the addresses of delinquents across Chicago's zones.
And what did they find? Did it match Burgess's model?
It did, remarkably well. They found that rates of delinquency were highest in the zone in transition and declined consistently as you moved outwards toward the more affluent, stable zones.
But couldn't that just be because certain groups prone to crime live there?
That's the crucial point. Shaw and McKay addressed that. They looked at data over several decades, tracking different ethnic and racial groups as they moved through the city. They found that the high delinquency rates remained concentrated in those same inner-city zone in transition neighborhoods, regardless of which specific ethnic or racial group was dominant there at any given time.
Wow. So as groups moved out to more stable areas,
The rates of delinquency decreased. This led Shaw and McKay to their powerful conclusion. It wasn't the characteristics of the people themselves, but the nature of the neighborhoods they lived in that primarily regulated involvement in crime.
the neighborhood itself generates crime, in a sense.
Or fails to prevent it. They argued that in stable, affluent communities, you had strong families, effective schools, community organizations, institutions that supervised children and transmitted conventional values. But in the zone of transition, these institutions were weakened by poverty, rapid population change, and cultural mixing. Young people lacked effective social constraints and often found excitement, companionship, and status in street gangs rather than conventional settings.
Shaw was also known for using personal stories, wasn't he? Life histories.
Yes, he was a big proponent of ethnographic methods, getting the own story through participant observation and in-depth interviews. His books, like The Jack Roller and Brothers in Crime, provided rich, qualitative accounts of how young men were drawn into delinquency, often learning from older peers, siblings, or gangs.
And this led to the idea of criminal traditions.
Exactly. Shaw and McKay concluded that these disorganized neighborhoods didn't just lack controls. They actively generated and sustained alternative value systems, or criminal traditions, that competed with conventional ones. These traditions, ways of thinking, behaving, justifying crime, were transmitted culturally from generation to generation, almost like learning a language.
So, young people learned criminal values through everyday interaction in these areas.
That was the argument. Whereas in more organized areas, where conventional institutions were strong, young people were effectively insulated from these deviant values.
And this sounds very much like the foundation for Sutherland's differential association theory we discussed before.
It absolutely is.
Hmm.
Sutherland built directly on this Chicago school work, formalizing the idea that criminal behavior is learned through association with others who hold criminal values.
The Chicago school seems incredibly influential, but were there criticisms?
Oh, yes, definitely. One critique was that while they emphasized the transmission of criminal culture, they didn't fully explain its origins. Where did these criminal traditions come from in the first place?
Good point.
Another criticism was their tendency to view the ecological processes and spatial distribution as somehow natural, potentially overlooking the role of power, economic inequality, and class domination in creating the slums and the conditions within them.
So they maybe didn't focus enough on the political and economic structures?
Some critics felt that way. Also, their explanation seems to fit best for explaining stable criminal roles and group-based offending, like gangs. It might not explain all types of crime, like crimes of passion or certain white-collar offenses, as effectively.
But despite the critiques, their contribution was massive.
Unquestionably. They firmly established the importance of the social environment, the neighborhood context, and social learning and understanding crime. Their empirical work was groundbreaking.
And they didn't just study it, they tried to intervene, right? The Chicago Area Project.
Yes. Shaw himself was instrumental in establishing the Chicago Area Project, CAP, in the 1930s. It was a very practical application of their theories.
What did CAP do?
The core idea was to empower local residents in high-crime neighborhoods to organize and take action themselves. They set up neighborhood committees, ran recreational programs to divert youth, worked on improving the physical environment to foster pride, acted as mediators for youth in trouble with schools or the law, and employed local adults, sometimes former offenders themselves, street-credible workers, to act as role models and guide young people towards conventional paths.
Did it work?
Evaluations conducted over many decades, as cited by Schlossman, Zellman, and Shavelson, suggested that CAP was indeed effective in reducing rates of juvenile delinquency in the areas where it operated.
So a real example of theory informing practice.
A classic example. The Chicago School's emphasis on social disorganization and cultural learning pointed towards solutions focused on community reorganization and treatment programs aimed at reversing criminal learning patterns. And their focus on social structure creating pressure or strain leads us naturally to Robert Merton.
Okay, Robert Merton and Anomie theory, another giant in the field. What was the scope of his theory?
Merton's theory is really ambitious. It aims to explain not just crime, but a whole range of deviant behaviors and social disorder. It's a macro-level sociological explanation.
And he borrowed the term enemy from Durkheim.
He did, explicitly. He adapted Durkheim's concept to try and make sense of the social strains and conflicts he saw in American society, particularly relating to things like the Great Depression and later, the social upheavals of the 1960s.
And you mentioned he challenged the American dream.
Fundamentally, his work directly questioned the dominant ideology of the U.S. as a classless, meritocratic society where hard work guarantees success for everyone. He argued that wasn't the reality for many people.
How did he build on the Chicago School and Durkheim?
Like the Chicago School, he rejected purely individualistic explanations. But he went further than Durkheim in some ways. While Durkheim saw aspirations as potentially limitless and needing social regulation, Merton argued that the specific goals people aspire to, like monetary success, are themselves socially learned or culturally defined. They aren't just natural human urges.
So society teaches us what to want.
Exactly. And his central argument focuses on the social structural limitations on people's access to the legitimate means to achieve those culturally defined goals. His theory isn't about personality, it's about your position within the social structure.
What's the key distinction he makes?
It's the crucial distinction between cultural goals and institutionalized means. Cultural goals are the things society holds up as worth striving for: wealth, status, material possessions, recognition. In the American context, he strongly emphasized monetary success as the dominant cultural goal.
Okay, the things we're told to aim for.
Right. And the institutionalized means are the socially approved, legitimate ways of achieving those goals. Things like getting a good education, working hard in an improved job, ethical entrepreneurship.
And the problem arises when these are out of sync.
Precisely. Merton argued that when a society puts intense emphasis on achieving the cultural goals, like wealth, but doesn't provide equal access to the legitimate means for everyone to achieve them, it creates strain or anomie. There's a disconnect, a structural imbalance.
And this strain leads people to adapt.
Yes. This cultural imbalance, particularly the overemphasis on success goals in the U.S., puts pressure on people. They feel they must succeed, and if the legitimate pathways are blocked, they might resort to any means necessary, including illegitimate or criminal ones, to achieve those goals. The ideal, Merton suggested, is a society where goals and means are in reasonable balance.
So how do people adapt to this strain? He outlined different ways, didn't he?
He did. He proposed 5 modes of adaptation to the strain caused by the gap between goals and means.
Okay, what's the first?
Conformity. This is the most common adaptation. People accept both the cultural goals, like success, and the institutionalized means, like hard work, even if they aren't actually succeeding. Society needs widespread conformity to be stable, but for those with limited opportunities, the strain can become too much.
So they might change their adaptation.
Exactly. They might lower their goals or reject the legitimacy of the means. These changes are forms of deviance.
What's the second mode?
Retreatism. This involves rejecting both the cultural goals and the institutionalized means. These are people who essentially drop out of the mainstream race. Merton saw examples in some forms of drug addiction, chronic alcoholism, vagrancy, people who are in the society but not of it. It's considered the least common adaptation.
Okay, dropping out entirely. Third.
Ritualism. Here, people give up on or scale back the ambitious cultural goals, but they rigidly, almost obsessively, adhere to the institutionalized means. They follow the rules for their own sake. Think of the bureaucrat who knows they'll never get promoted but compulsively follows every regulation. They find security in the routine, the means, even if the original goal is lost. Playing it safe, sticking to the rules. What's number 4? This seems key for crime. Innovation. This is indeed the mode most often linked to criminal behavior. Innovators accept the dominant cultural goals, especially monetary success, but they reject or simply lack access to the legitimate institutionalized means. So they innovate, they find new, often illegitimate ways to achieve the desired success.
Like theft, fraud, drug dealing.
Those are classic examples. But Merton noted innovation can cover a wide range. Some innovators might find novel but socially acceptable routes in fields like sports or entertainment, especially if conventional paths were blocked. These might even be celebrated. Others use clearly illegal means, which are destabilizing.
So it's about using unconventional methods to reach conventional goals.
That's the core idea. The innovator overemphasizes the goal, success, and sees the legitimate means as irrelevant or inaccessible. They'll use whatever strategy works to overcome the barriers. And the final mode, rebellion. Rebels reject both the existing cultural goals and the institutionalized means, but unlike retreatists, they want to replace them with a new social order, new goals, new means. They seek to fundamentally change the system. Interest in this mode resurged in the 1960s with the rise of countercultural and political movements.
It's a comprehensive framework. What were the main criticisms leveled against Merton's theory?
Several significant ones. First, as mentioned by radical critics like Taylor, Walton, and Young, it's often called a theory of the middle range.
Yeah.
It explains the mechanism of strain, but doesn't deeply analyze the historical or political economic roots of the inequality or the exaggerated emphasis on monetary success that creates the strain in the first place.
So it doesn't explain where the goals and unequal means come from.
Not in depth. Second, it doesn't seem to explain all forms of deviance very well. For example, things like recreational drug use among people who seem to accept both goals and means don't fit neatly.
Okay. What else?
Third, critics like Lamert argued that Merton assumes too much value consensus that everyone shares the same primary goal, like wealth. Lamert suggested societies actually have a plurality of values, making the simple ends means calculation more complex. Merton acknowledged other goals were possible, but didn't emphasize group differences enough.
And the fourth main criticism.
It was often criticized for appearing to focus too heavily on lower-class crime. The assumption seemed to be that the lower classes experience the most strain and are therefore most likely to innovate through crime. This potentially overlooks white-collar crime committed by the privileged, and also ignores the vast amount of conformity found among the poor. It seems to predict too much crime at the bottom and too little at the top.
So maybe too simplistic in its class analysis.
That was the argument. However, defenders note Merton was likely focused on the types of visible street crime that were the main public and political concerns at the time, and the theory has proven adaptable.
How so? Has it been applied beyond street crime?
Yes, significantly. Later researchers, particularly those working within the victimized actor tradition, applied anomie theory very effectively to corporate crime.
How does that work? Corporations don't have feelings of strain.
No, but the theory can be applied at an organizational level. Researchers like Etzioni and Box argued you need to look beyond individual motivation to the corporate goal primarily, maximizing profit. Corporations face structural obstacles to achieving this goal, lawfully competitors, regulations, unions, consumer groups.
So the corporation innovates to overcome these obstacles.
Exactly. Box argued that corporations adopt illegal strategies, price fixing, pollution, unsafe products as innovative means to overcome these barriers and achieve the goal of profit maximization. There's empirical support too. Staw and Swieczkowski found firms facing challenging economic environments were more likely to engage in illegal competitive practices.
Does it also relate to the kind of people who succeed in corporations?
Box suggested it might. He argued, drawing on Gross, that corporate promotion systems might favor individuals with characteristics suited for business crime. Ambitious, perhaps morally flexible, identifying their success with the organization's success. Achieving success might even free executives from feeling bound by conventional values. Box's view here is arguably closer to Durkheim's original concept of anomie as deregulation.
And it's not just about money.
No. Braithwaite pointed out strain can apply to other organizational goals. He used the example of pharmacologists fabricating drug safety tests and illegitimate means used not just for profit, but perhaps to defend professional prestige or meet research deadlines when legitimate means, proper testing, were blocked or too slow.
Interesting. Has it been applied to hate crime too?
It has. Researchers like Levin and McDevitt observed hate crime offenders often blaming their own economic problems on immigrant groups, a perceived blockage of their own goals. And Hopkins, Burke, and Pollock offer a really interesting twist, arguing that for hate crime, even conformity can be problematic.
How can conformity be problematic?
Merton sort of takes conformity for granted. Why do people buy into the legitimacy of the social order? Hopkins, Burke, and Pollock suggest that conformity to certain local norms, group values, our kind, or simply a lack of opportunity, might keep latent prejudiced attitudes under control. But a trigger, a change in circumstances like new arrivals or exposure to extremist ideas online, can activate this latent hate.
So the hate motivation itself might be seen as normal within a specific conforming group.
That's their provocative argument. They suggest hate motivation can be unremarkable, internalized through socialization within specific macro, mezzo, or micro-mechanical solidarities, valuing hard work, law-abidingness within the group, conformity, opportunity within a like-minded setting actualizes it, and tacit approval from a silent majority provides support. It links conformity within one group to deviance against another.
That really turns the usual view of conformity on its head. What about gender? Did Merton apply his theory to women?
That's another key criticism he largely didn't. Later feminist critics like Leonard argued his typology didn't fit women's experiences well, suggesting perhaps women were socialized towards different primary goals, like successful relationships rather than material wealth. We'll likely return to this.
So despite all the criticisms, Merton's theory remains pretty significant.
Oh, absolutely. It's generally viewed sympathetically. It broadened the study of crime immeasurably by highlighting social structure. Some wished he'd gone further towards radical critique, but that wasn't his aim. He provided a vital starting point and framework.
And his ideas were developed further by others.
Yes, notably by Messner and Rosenfeld with their institutional anomie theory, IAT.
How does IAT build on Merton?
They take Merton's cultural critique even further. They argue the American dream itself. This intense commitment to universal material success has become a cultural ethos that dominates all social institutions.
Dominates them. How?
They argue that non-economic institutions, family, education, politics, become subservient to the economy. Education is valued primarily for job prospects. Political success hinges on economic performance. Family life is often structured around corporate needs. The economy rules.
And this imbalance is anomie.
For Messner and Rosenfeld, this institutional imbalance, this cultural dominance of economic goals promoted by the American dream, is the primary source of anomie and high crime rates. The overwhelming emphasis on finding the most efficient way to achieve economic success makes crime seem like a rational, effective choice for immediate gain.
So it's the culture itself that's criminogenic.
That's their core argument. The values associated with the American dream, intense focus on achievement measured by money, fierce individualism, a universal belief that everyone can succeed leading to fear of failure, and a fetishism of money with no sense of enough, foster an environment where people are more likely to pursue wealth by any means necessary.
And what does that mean for things like the war on crime?
They're deeply skeptical. If lawlessness stems from this fundamental structural emphasis on the economy, then simply cracking down on specific crimes without addressing the underlying cultural and institutional imbalance is unlikely to succeed. It indirectly attacks the very economic system that's driving the problem.
That's a powerful critique. And these ideas about strain, opportunity, and cultural values lead directly into theories about deviant subcultures, right?
Absolutely. The notion that certain groups develop distinct values and attitudes that encourage delinquency flows naturally from Merton and the Chicago School. This became a huge area of focus, especially in the U.S. in the mid-20th century.
What were the main ingredients that went into these subculture theories?
You can see about 5 main inputs converging. First, Merton's anomie theory, the idea that deviance arises from blocked opportunities. Second, the Chicago School's detailed case studies showing youth in disorganized areas developing different moral standards transmitted culturally. Third, Talcott Parsons' functionalist idea, influenced by Freud, of a masculine identity crisis in homes where fathers were absent, leading boys to seek masculine validation through rebellious acts.
Okay. Strain, cultural transmission, identity issues. What else?
Fourth, Sutherland's differential association, which developed directly from the Chicago School, emphasizing learning criminal behavior through interaction. And fifth, early gang studies, also in the Chicago tradition, like Thrasher's work suggesting gangs emerged from street play in disorganized areas, seeking fun and excitement not found elsewhere. The concept of a distinct delinquent subculture emerged from this mix.
So let's dig into some of those early U.S. subculture theories. Albert Cohen.
Cohen, in 1955, offered a key analysis. He observed that a lot of juvenile offending wasn't really about making money, like Merton's theory might predict. It was often non-utilitarian vandalism, fighting done for fun, for status within the group, for a reputation as tough.
So not innovation for wealth, but something else.
Right. Cohen argued the gang or subculture provides status and respect that working-class boys are denied in the wider society, particularly in middle-class dominated institutions like schools. He called this status frustration.
How did that frustration arise?
Society is stratified, but middle-class norms and values, achievement, ambition, deferred gratification, are dominant and used to judge everyone. Working-class boys with different upbringing and values are thrust into this competitive system, fail by middle-class standards, feel inadequate, and experience status frustration.
And the subculture is the solution.
It's a collective solution. Boys facing the same problem come together and create their own alternative status system, a separate subculture with norms that are often the direct opposite of middle-class values: hedonism, aggression, malice, valuing immediate gratification. Within this subculture, they can achieve status and respect by rejecting the system that rejected them.
Did this theory hold up?
It faced significant criticism. It wasn't strongly based on empirical data, and attempts to test it often failed. Critics like Kitsus and Dietrich argued Cohen misunderstood working-class youth. They claimed these boys simply weren't interested in middle-class status in the first place, so they weren't frustrated by failing to achieve it. Their offending might be more rational or utilitarian within their own cultural context.
So an alternative view came from Walter Miller.
Yes, Walter Miller, in 1958, argued that delinquency wasn't a reaction against middle-class values, but a direct expression of lower-class culture itself. He identified a set of focal concerns central to lower-class life, things like trouble, toughness, smartness, street smarts, excitement, fate, autonomy.
And living out these concerns leads to crime.
Essentially, yes. Acting in ways that demonstrate toughness or seek excitement often involves violating the law. For Miller, delinquency was a normal outcome of conforming to the expectations of lower-class culture. Being working class, in his view, almost naturally inclined one towards deviance. He explicitly attacked the status frustration idea.
But where did these lower class values come from? Did he explain that?
That was a weakness. He described the focal concerns and stated that conforming to them leads to crime, but didn't really explain their origins, making it sound quite deterministic. Interestingly, his work also connected back to Parsons' masculinity crisis idea, suggesting that female-dominated households in lower-class communities led boys to seek male role models and status in street gangs, where these focal concerns were paramount.
Okay, so Cohen focused on reaction, Miller on existing culture. What about Cloward and Olin? Theirs was a major work, right?
Huge. Delinquency and Opportunity, 1960, was incredibly influential, bridging sociological positivism towards labeling theory. They tried to synthesize Merton and Sutherland Shaw. They argued you need two kinds of explanation. One for the initial pressure or push towards deviance, Merton's strain, and another for the pull, how deviance is learned and sustained, Sutherland Shaw's cultural transmission.
So combining blocked opportunity with learning.
Exactly. They focused on the discrepancy between the aspirations of working-class youth, often similar to middle-class aspirations, they argued, and the limited legitimate opportunities available to them due to class, race, education, etc. Recognizing this unfairness leads them to blame the system, withdraw their belief in its legitimacy, and reject conventional rules.
And like Cohen, they form groups.
Yes, they seek out others with similar problems and develop a collective solution. They need group support and also ways to neutralize guilt for breaking rules they might still partly believe in. But Cloward and Olin added a crucial element: the illegitimate opportunity structure.
Illegitimate opportunities, what does that mean?
Just as there are legitimate ways to get ahead, they argued there are also varying opportunities to succeed through illegitimate means. Access to these illegitimate opportunities isn't equal either. It depends on the neighborhood. This combines Shaw's focus on neighborhood traditions, Sutherland's learning, and Merton's opportunity structures.
And this led them to predict different types of delinquent subcultures.
Yes, based on the availability of illegitimate opportunities, they predicted three main types. One, the criminal subculture, found in stable, organized neighborhoods where there's an established hierarchy of adult crime. Youth can learn criminal skills and values, progressing towards adult criminal careers, like theft, extortion. Two, the conflict subculture, found in highly disorganized areas lacking both stable, legitimate, and illegitimate opportunities. Frustrated youth express themselves through violence, gang fighting, vandalism, seeking status through toughness and reputation. Three, the retreatist subculture, composed of youth who fail to succeed in either the legitimate or the illegitimate worlds, the double failures. They retreat into drug use and alcoholism.
So the type of delinquency depends on the local structure of opportunity, both legal and illegal.
That was their key insight. And they made predictions for the 1960s. They expected the classic criminal subculture to decline as inner cities became more unstable, while conflict and retreatist subcultures, violence, drugs, would likely expand.
How was Cloward and Olin's theory received?
It was hugely influential, especially on social policy, like the War on Poverty programs. But it also faced criticism. Some argued their model of the stable criminal gang was based on outdated Chicago gangs from the 20s and 30s. They were criticized for assuming a homogeneous working class and for offering a somewhat simplistic view of drug use, which occurs across classes. And like earlier theories, it raised debates about determinism versus choice.
Did anyone try to test or refine their ideas about opportunity structures?
Ivan Spergel did, in 1964. He looked at the gap between youth's aspirations and their actual expectations for jobs and wages, the Anomie gap, and found it differed between offenders and non-offenders, and between different types of subcultures.
Did he agree with Cloward and Olin's three types?
Not entirely. He proposed his own typology based more on local neighborhood features, rather than just the integration of legitimate, illegitimate opportunities. He identified racket subcultures, where organized crime is visible, theft subcultures, less organized property crime, and conflict subcultures, gang fighting, where other opportunities are scarce.
And what about drug use?
Spergel saw drug use not as a distinct subculture itself, but as something common across all subcultures, often occurring during transitions between different activities. He really emphasized the local features of a district shaped its common forms of deviance, pushing back against overly broad national explanations like Mertens or Cloward and Olin's.
Looking back at these early U.S. theories, Cohen, Miller, Cloward and Olin, Spergel, what are the main overarching criticisms?
Several recurring themes. They tend to be overly deterministic, portraying offenders as almost inevitably pushed into deviance by forces beyond their control, failing to explain why most youth facing the same conditions don't become seriously delinquent.
Right, the problem of explaining conformity.
Exactly. They also often assumed delinquency was primarily a gang phenomenon, which might overestimate the prevalence of stable, organized gangs. Much offending is solitary or in small, shifting groups. They largely ignore the role of authority figures, police, teachers, social workers, in labeling and reacting to youth behavior, a point later theories would pick up.
And the issue of stopping offending.
Yes, they generally fail to explain why most delinquents grow out of offending as they mature. And critically, they almost entirely focused on males, ignoring or dismissing female delinquency. Plus, the assumption that serious offending was confined to the lower working class was clearly inaccurate.
So, quite a few limitations. But has the subculture concept itself been useful beyond explaining youth gangs?
It has, actually. It's been applied quite effectively to areas like corporate and business crime. Researchers like Aubert and Braithwaite found that white-collar criminals often belong to groups with shared norms and ideologies that rationalize or justify their illegal activities. Things like bribery or cutting corners might be seen as normal, expected practices within that specific business subculture.
So, learning deviant norms within the workplace?
Yes, though it's not usually seen as fully deterministic. Studies show individuals still have choices, and some resist pressures to conform to unethical practices. But the group culture can certainly encourage it.
Any other applications?
It's also been valuable in thinking about hate crime, as we discussed with Hopkins Burke and Pollock, linking it to specific mechanical solidarities or group identities. And it's been used to understand police behavior, particularly the idea of a canteen culture, identified in the UK's Macpherson report after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry.
Police canteen culture. What's that?
It refers to a shared set of attitudes, values, and working practices developed informally among police officers, often characterized by cynicism, suspicion, macho values, and an us versus them mentality. This culture, transmitted through socialization, could lead to stereotyping the public, differentiating between respectable people like us and others, toe rags, etc., which could then drive discriminatory policing practices. Macpherson identified this as contributing to institutional racism.
So, the subculture concept helps explain group behavior in institutions, too.
It can, yes. It helps understand how shared experiences and pressures within an occupational group can lead to collective attitudes and behaviors that deviate from official rules or wider societal norms.
What about subcultural studies in Britain? Did they just follow the U.S. lead?
They were certainly influenced, particularly by Miller and Cohen, less so by Cloward and Olin initially. But British studies often had a slightly different flavor, perhaps more grounded in class analysis and specific historical contexts.
Who are some key figures?
Early work by John Mays in Liverpool suggested older urban areas had shared working-class attitudes predisposing youth to delinquency passed down through generations. Terence Morris argued crime was largely a working-class phenomenon, resulting from different socialization patterns, less family control, more influence from street peer groups. David Downs, studying London's East End, found less evidence for status frustration. He saw working-class youth responding to lack of schoolwork success, not by reacting against middle-class values, but by dissociating, opting out, focusing on leisure and excitement. Limited money for entertainment then led to utilitarian petty crime.
So, more about boredom and lack of options.
Yes, and Peter Wilmot's study, also in the East End, reached similar conclusions to Miller adolescent offending as part of lower working-class culture, done for fun and togetherness. Howard Parker's Liverpool study emphasized loosely knit peer groups, not tight gangs, stealing car radios as a temporary solution to unemployment, often condoned by the local community if victims were outsiders.
And studies of minority groups.
Ken Price's study of African Caribbean youth in Bristol is important. He described how high aspirations met with low-status jobs and pervasive racism led to adaptations. Some remained conformist, but others developed an expressive, rebellious subculture as a response to endless pressure.
What's the overall significance of these early British studies?
They drew attention to specific economic conditions and structural class issues. They showed different working class groups faced distinct problems and developed their own solutions or adaptations. A major limitation, like the U.S. studies, was their neglect of female involvement.
Have more recent U.S. studies continued this focus on class and environment?
Yes, often focusing on violence, ethnicity, and poverty. Wolfgang and Ferracuti developed the idea of a subculture of violence, where responding aggressively to perceived insults is expected. Curtis adapted this to explain violence among some black communities as linked to maintaining a manly image in response to marginalization. Others studied ideologically motivated group violence, like racist skinheads.
And poverty is still seen as a key driver.
It's probably the most dominant theme currently. Even Miller later adopted a culture of poverty view. William Julius Wilson's underclass theory has been very influential, arguing that social isolation in poor urban neighborhoods lacking jobs and networks leads youth towards illegal activities for income.
Though Wilson's theory has also been critiqued.
Yes, for not fully explaining why gangs form or the specific types of activities they engage in. But the general correlation between concentrated poverty, social exclusion, gangs, and violence is widely observed by many researchers. They see subcultures emerging as compensatory efforts, ways to adapt and solve problems arising from lack of legitimate resources.
This sounds like it connects to more radical or critical perspectives, too.
It does. A very significant strand of subculture theory emerged from the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, CCCS, in the UK during the 1970s, often associated with neo-Marxist or victimized actor approaches.
What did the Birmingham School focus on?
They focused particularly on spectacular youth subcultures, teddy boys, mods, skinheads, punks. They interpreted these groups not just as delinquent, but as arising at specific historical moments as symbolic or cultural solutions to the same kinds of structural economic problems and anomie that Durkheim and Merton identify.
Solutions? How?
They argued these subcultures, rooted in working-class parent cultures but adapting to new circumstances, use style, distinctive dress, music, rituals as a form of resistance. They weren't necessarily trying to achieve material success, but to symbolically resist dominant cultural values, defend working-class or ethnic identities, reclaim a sense of community, or reassert tradition in the face of changes they felt powerless against.
So the style itself had meaning. It was resistance.
Yes, but importantly, they saw this resistance as largely symbolic, ritualistic, or magical, rather than genuinely political or effective in changing material conditions. Stan Cohen described how this resistance was often aimed at inappropriate targets, like skinheads attacking minority groups as a displaced reaction to perceived threats to their community or masculinity, and didn't confront the real economic basis of their subordination. The style denoted meaning like a skinhead's boots being a coded statement about working-class identity, but it didn't solve the underlying problems.
Did they only look at these spectacular subcultures?
No, they also studied more mainstream working-class youth, looking at the transition from school to work or unemployment. Researchers like Paul Willis and Paul Corrigan described a culture of resistance in schools' truancy, messing about as a rejection of alienating education and boring future prospects. Again, these actions were seen as ritualistic ways of coping, not effective solutions.
What was the main contribution of the Birmingham School?
They provided a much more historically and politically aware analysis of youth deviance, linking it clearly to class structure, economic conditions, and cultural responses to inequality and change.
Yeah.
They recognized subcultures as meaningful collective responses, not just passive adaptations.
Were there critiques of their work?
One criticism was that they sometimes presented a rather linear view of subcultural history, with one style neatly replacing another as historical circumstances changed. For example, mods reflecting 60s optimism, punks reflecting late 70s recession.
And more recent views see it differently.
Yes. Perspectives influenced by postmodernism, like Hopkins, Burke, and Sunlees, suggest that today's fragmented society sees the coexistence of many diverse subcultures. Groups form to create solutions to their specific problems and experiences. Central to this view is choice.
Choice. But aren't these theories usually deterministic?
Earlier theories often implied little choice, but this newer perspective emphasizes that individuals and groups, not just the traditional working class, experience social change differently and actively choose subcultural affiliations and styles as ways to navigate their circumstances. However, and this is crucial, it's still constrained choice.
Ah, constrained choice again,
Right.
limited by structure.
Exactly. Choices are possible, but limited by structural factors like class, ethnicity, gender, resources. It acknowledges agency, but within limits. And this brings us perfectly to the theorist who most directly challenged the determinism of the early subculture tradition, David Mansa.
David Monson. So he provided a major critique of that deterministic view.
Yes, his work in the 1960s, particularly Delinquency and Drift, is seen as a crucial turning point, offering a bridge towards less deterministic, more interactionist perspectives. He argued that nearly all criminological theory up to that point, from Lombroso onwards, had made three flawed assumptions.
What were those assumptions?
First, they focused almost exclusively on the criminal and their behavior, largely ignoring the role of the criminal justice system and social reaction, the environment of the criminal. Second, they were overly deterministic, effectively rejecting free will and failing to recognize that humans make choices, even if those choices are constrained. Third, they assumed criminals are fundamentally different from non-criminals, whether biologically, psychologically, or culturally determined.
And he pointed out they couldn't explain growing out of crime.
That was a key empirical problem for deterministic theories. If delinquents were truly compelled by biological flaws or subcultural codes, logically they should continue offending indefinitely unless stopped by force. But the reality is, most juvenile offenders desist. Determinism couldn't explain this common pattern.
So what was Matz's alternative proposal?
He suggested that delinquency isn't a fixed characteristic or state of being, but rather a status that individuals occupy, and delinquents are essentially role players who intermittently act out a delinquent role.
Intermittently, not all the time.
Exactly. He introduced the concept of drift. He argued that young people, particularly males, exist in a state of drift between conventional and delinquent behavior. They aren't fully committed to either. Most of the time, the forces compelling delinquency, if they exist, are inactive. They are free to choose, and sometimes they choose delinquency, sometimes convention.
So they're not bound by a deviant subculture.
Mansa accepted that subcultures involving delinquency existed, but he strongly denied the existence of a specific deviant subculture that functioned as a contraculture, one deliberately and fundamentally opposed to dominant societal values.
Why did he reject the contraculture idea?
He argued it didn't fit the evidence. First, if it were a true contraculture, members shouldn't feel guilt, but Mansa observed that delinquents often do experience guilt and remorse. Second, it assumes members have no respect for conventional morality, but most delinquents recognize the legitimacy of the overall social order and its moral standards even if they break them. Third, the idea implies delinquents see all outsiders as legitimate victims, but they often make distinctions. Fourth, members of a subculture are still children, living within the larger society. They cannot be totally immune to the demands and disapproval of adults, parents, teachers, whose condemnation they likely internalize to some extent.
So you could be in the subculture without always offending.
Matza thought so. You can hang out with a group, share some attitudes, but not participate in every delinquent act. He noted that delinquents often express disapproval when shown pictures of crimes, even their own.
How did Matza see the process of actually becoming deviant then? He had stages.
Yes, he outlined a sort of developmental process in 3 stages. Stage 1 is where the individual is closest to the idea of an oppositional subculture. It involves being in the company of other males where there's an implicit ideology of delinquency. The motivation here is often anxiety about group acceptance, about proving one's masculinity, about appearing grown-up.
Anxiety drives the initial acts.
Through what Matza called mutual misunderstanding, individuals pick up cues from others about the correct way to behave, the expected attitudes. They see others apparently approving of or engaging in illegal acts, and they assume they must join in to be accepted, to be seen as tough or cool. They might steal or fight, not because they genuinely want to, but because they feel they ought to want to. It's what being grown up or one of the guys seems to require.
And they don't realize others feel the same pressure.
Exactly. Everyone is taking cues from everyone else, assuming a commitment that might not actually be there. They're trapped in a cycle of misinterpretation. This might break down if they actually talk honestly or simply mature out of these anxieties. At this stage, they can still decide to leave the group or stop the behavior.
Okay, so that's stage 1, driven by anxiety. What's stage 2?
Stage 2 involves overcoming that initial anxiety and, crucially, overcoming the individual's initial socialization against deviance. To drift into delinquency, they need to protect themselves from feeling guilt. They need to find extenuating circumstances or justifications that temporarily release them from the grip of conventional morality, freeing them up to choose deviance.
And this is where the famous techniques of neutralization come in.
Precisely. Developed with Gresham Sykes, these are justifications or rationalizations people use before committing a deviant act, making it psychologically possible. They aren't post hoc excuses, but ways of defining the situation beforehand.
Can you remind us of those techniques?
Sure. They include denial of responsibility. I didn't mean it. I was drunk. It wasn't my fault. Denial of injury. They can afford it. Nobody got hurt. Denial of a victim. They had it coming. He's not one of us. Condemnation of the condemners. Everyone's corrupt. The police are worse. And appeal to higher loyalties. I had to help my friends. I did it for my family gang.
So these allow someone to break the rules without seeing themselves as truly bad.
Yes, they neutralize the moral bind of the law. Matza also suggested a deeper level commitment involving subterranean values, values like seeking excitement, thrills, toughness, that exist in the wider culture but are usually kept suppressed. Delinquency can be a way to express these values, particularly the need for stimulation. Sometimes acts are done because they are forbidden. It's fun, it's exciting, it beats boredom.
And the justice system might even play a role here.
Matza thought so. Young people might see that authorities often treat them as not fully responsible, yet punish them anyway. They recognize this contradiction and might exploit it, further weakening the moral force of the law.
Okay, so they've learned the justifications. What happens in stage 3?
Stage 3 is drift proper. The individual now knows what's required for delinquency. They've learned the neutralizations. But, and this is key for Matza, they are still not automatically committed to deviance. They could just boast about delinquent acts without doing them.
So what provides the final push, the impetus to act?
For Matza, it's ultimately an act of free will, or human agency. This recognition distinguishes him sharply from the predestined actor models. The individual makes a choice. They're responsible. They generally know the activity is illegal, know they might be caught, and often accept punishment as part of the rules of the game if it happens.
But why do they choose to act if they're not committed?
Matza suggested a couple of reasons beyond simple repetition. First, preparation, having acquired the skills from friends, media, and learned how to manage guilt and discount capture, makes repeating the offense easier. Second, and less frequently, a sense of desperation or fatalism.
Desperation? How does that lead to crime?
It's the feeling of being pushed around, of lacking control over one's life. To counter this, the individual might feel a powerful need to make something happen, to assert their agency, to prove they are a cause, not just an effect. This can lead them to commit a more serious or novel offense, something that forces the system to react to them. Even getting caught proves they made something happen. In this state of desperation, simple repetition isn't enough. They need something more impactful.
That's a much more nuanced view choice. Anxiety, justification, fatalism, all playing a role.
It is. It brings the human element, the subjective experience, back into the picture while still acknowledging the social context that shapes motivations and provides the vocabulary for justification.
Have Matza's ideas, especially techniques of neutralization, been applied elsewhere?
Yes, very much so. Mike Box, for instance, applied them brilliantly to business crime. He showed how corporate executives use precisely these kinds of techniques to rationalize violating laws without feeling guilty.
Like denying responsibility by claiming ignorance or blaming diffuse decision-making.
Exactly. Or denying the victim is just another corporation. They live far away. Denying injury, it was only a technical violation. No one was really harmed. Condemning the condemners, government regulation stifle free enterprise, or appealing to higher loyalties, I did it for the good of the company.
So the same psychological mechanisms can operate at the top as well as on the street.
That's the argument. And Hopkins, Burke, and Pollock also use these techniques to understand hate crime. Perpetrators use phrases that clearly deny the victim, they are different, they don't belong here, or appeal to higher loyalties. Something has to be done for our community. They argue that absorbing these rationalizations through socialization makes the choice to commit hate acts seem rational to the perpetrator, especially, as SIB found, when these views are shared and implicitly supported by their local community or subculture, reinforcing the behavior.
So Matza's work really highlights how people navigate moral rules and make choices within their social world.
It does. He provided a crucial critique of determinism and shifted the focus towards understanding the interplay between social pressures, cultural values, individual interpretation, and constrained choice.
Okay, wrapping up this whole section on sociological positivism, what are the main takeaways?
Well, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? from Durkheim's foundational ideas about social facts and anomie through the Chicago school's focus on environment and learning, Merton's influential strain theory, the diverse landscape of subculture theories, and finally, Motz's anti-determinist critique.
A lot of ground covered.
Indeed. I think the enduring legacy, even of the early, more deterministic theories, is the powerful recognition that social factors outside the individual social structures, cultural norms, neighborhood conditions, group associations, play a crucial role in shaping behavior, including crime. They place significant constraints on individual choice.
That idea of constraints seems key.
It is. It's almost common sense now, even if it's only a partial explanation. Later theorists, building on and reacting to these foundations, moved towards a more nuanced understanding of constrained choice. It's not a return to the pure, rational actor model, assuming total free will, but an acknowledgement that our choices are always limited and shaped by our life, chances, our background, resources, opportunities, the social circumstances we find ourselves in.
And this focus on constraints and how they're distributed leads us towards the next set of theories.
Exactly. It sets the stage perfectly for exploring the victimized actor model, which delves much more deeply into how power, inequality, and social reaction shape not only behavior, but also how crime itself is defined and who gets targeted by the system.
Excellent. So we've seen how looking at society, its solidarity, its disorganization, its strains, its subcultures, and the ways individuals navigate all that profoundly changes how we understand crime.
It forces us to look beyond the individual actor to the social stage on which they act.
So for you listening, maybe think about your own community through these lenses. Can you see signs of social disorganization or strain between goals and means? Are there visible subcultures? And how might they relate to local opportunities or frustrations? Do Durkheim's ideas about solidarity resonate?
It's a powerful toolkit for analysis, even if no single theory explains everything. And as we've seen, the conversation evolves. Motz's critique opened the door to thinking more about agency and labeling, which we'll explore further.
We certainly will. We'll continue unpacking these complex interactions between individual, society, and the definition of crime itself in future deep dives.
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with, drawing from this sociological perspective. If normal social processes, learning group values, conforming to local expectations, using common justifications can lead to behavior defined as deviant or criminal, what does that tell us about the very nature of conformity and deviance? How much is the line between them simply drawn by the specific social groups, the specific mechanical solidarities we happen to be part of?
A challenging question. Plenty to think about there.